How dare this stupid space movie about a raccoon make me cry? I went to go see Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 last night, and this final outing of our Guardians is definitely a darker and more mature depiction of our team than the previous two, plus the holiday special, so 2.5 films that we got. It's not to say the previous two films didn't tackle deep subjects. Indeed, I think they were actually so successful and so well crafted because they were first and foremost films about redemption through the people you connect with before being action comedy genre films. But the first two films follow the Guardians as they were still bonding as a family. The first film was when they first met. The second film was only a few months set after that, and they were still getting over kind of their dysfunctions and their flaws. Volume 3 is set more than a decade after most of these characters first met, and you can definitely feel that's the case with their interactions, the tone, even the ways they equip at each other. They interact, they interact together, they work together, they fight together like a group of people who know each other very well, and the quips and they make each other. And there's still some quips, but it's not the kind of the same juvenile, snipey quipping that's there to mask the insecurities. It's more of the grown up and affectionate quips. There's that kind of healthy sibling edge to at least most of the jokes, and so there's less kind of childish elements to it. It's more genuine, but genuine in the kind of the family bond way. And they do fight in this film due to insecurities, but when they actually do legitimately have arguments and not covering it with the jokes. They're being honest with each other, and I think that shows the development of character. And the reduction in the quips and the much more revolting villain. And that's saying something, because Ego was pretty revolting. Ronan actually was pretty generic, all things considered. And again, I don't have a problem with. I know people criticize Marvel's villain problem. I don't really care about Marvel's so-called villain problem. I think most of the villains are never really the focus, except when they're meant to be. So I don't care if the ones who aren't the important ones are the less kind of part of the sum. But this film was entirely a much more morbid experience, and is that to its detriment that it goes for a darker edge? Unclear. Guardians of the Galaxy, the two previous films, have kind of always played the role of a palate cleanser to the darker stories that have preceded it, or at least the big kind of impactful and scale stories that have preceded it. But a lot has changed for these characters. A lot has changed in the franchise. A lot has changed with us as viewers and where the universe is at the moment. It's much more bigger and much more grounded and much more lived in and much more traumatized universe. Obviously, we still feel the effects of Thanos' snap, and I think that's the appropriate move to make, that we don't immediately move on from that and it still kind of pushes into the rest of the franchise. And I think the fact that they all feel like changed people is a very earned development from that, even though we have this weird chronology where we don't actually follow their progression in a linear fashion, because obviously the first two films came out 3 years apart, but we set a few months apart, and then we had this kind of time jump, but really it was only 2 years for us, but it was actually more 5 years for them, and then obviously the 5-year gap. But then COVID also made it kind of feel longer for us as well, so it's kind of all over the place, really. But as I always say, when you're making sequels, I mostly to myself actually, because I don't have much to talk to, but I always do say that sometimes it's better to aim for something different and something better. This is actually my defense of Age of Ultron. I think you were never going to recreate the Avengers because it's a one-in-a-lifetime film. It was the first film to do what it did. You're never going to do that again. So with Age of Ultron, I know, in retrospect, actually a lot of it was quite messy. A lot of it was kind of interfered with politics of the production studio, but I still think that they did, whatever both the actual outcome and the original intent, I think both aimed to do something different rather than better, and I think that was the correct thing to do. And I think that's kind of what happened here. The first two films came fairly early on. I think they were, in the first, well, they would have been in the first decade. Okay, so not early on, partially, but they were fairly, in the large scheme of things, I'm getting my words mixed up here, but the first two films came at times where they were still fresh, but now they're kind of coalesced and their impact's kind of permeated for the rest of the MCU. I don't think you could recreate the first two Guardians at this point of the MCU production timeline. So I think it's the right move that it is something different. I do still wonder how much that shift is possibly also due to a delayed release with Gunn being fired and then coming back, having to push back the franchise because of his, DC commitments. But it definitely felt different. I think it's a lot to kind of think about, and speaking of new things, I'm unsure if it's because at this point I'm used to the MCU cosmic aesthetic. When the first two films came out, they were the only two films that were exploring the cosmic side of the MCU. Everything else was grounded on Earth. But now, since then, with Captain Marvel, with Ms. Marvel, with Thor, we've now kind of pushed and kind of made this more of the equal setting of the MCU. So we're very much grounded in the cosmic part of it, so it feels less fresh and new. So I think because of that, the film doesn't feel as visually captivating as the previous two, including I think the camera work. I'm not sure, maybe I wasn't paying that much attention to it. And also, that being said, I'm on the record for being a sucker for long runners, and this film has about 3, I think, so I'm spoiled for those, and that's all great. So I think that actually wins me over. There's like the opening. I think the opening isn't quite as fun as the previous two openings, but again, that kind of goes back to my whole, this is a much more darker film, but it's still a very impressive runner. Like, it's one shot that follows Rocket, which is impressive from I think also a CGI point of view, because he looks great the entire shot. It does feel very video gamey, I think, actually, because the way they shot the character is kind of the same framing you typically use for over the shoulder video game shots. And so we kind of were following him, and it felt like he was our character. But maybe that was kind of the point. Maybe it was kind of trying to evoke those feelings. But it was a very extended runner, very Firefly in that sense of seeing everyone interact with each other, introducing the characters in that way, but being very understated. So the Guardians films have always been about characters, have always been about their relationships and their flaws, and the film does not deliver on those. So to break down the different characters who are the driving forces of this film, Rocket is the driving force behind the plot, with us exploring his backstory, but he does actually spend a lot of the present day elements of the plot unconscious. But I think despite that, Gunn does successfully deliver a story which, when you think about it, is very tragic, and it does fit. You can get this confirmation of what Rocket's backstory is. None of it's kind of surprising. It was all inferred from the previous two films that this is why he has so much trauma, but seeing on screen does, solidify that kind of traumatic element to it. And you can see everything happens in there, and you can understand why Rocket acts the way he does in the previous films, why he kind of is so insistent on pushing people away, all of that kind of elements to his character that we explored particularly in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. And honestly, him finally confronting the High Evolutionary and accepting his identity as a raccoon, it was very much a win, alongside the other Guardians supporting him in that kind of element. I did enjoy that scene. The High Evolutionary is a very effective villain. Gunn, I read on Wikipedia, said that he didn't, set out to create a multi-dimensional villain. It is a strategy that's often at odds with what a lot of critics kind of feel we need. A lot of people criticize the MCU for not having multi-dimensional villains and feel that, films which have one-dimensional ones are often lesser for it, and the ones which do have more nuanced villains are better for it. But like I said earlier, I think villains should be what the story necessitates, and Gunn correctly recognizes that in this instance, we don't need to feel any redeeming features for the High Evolutionary. We need a one-dimensional villain that we will instantly and immediately and at the core of our very soul hate, and that's the case here. He is despicable to his own core, and like the rest of the characters in the film, we immediately detest him and his motivations. And Chukwudi Iwuji does a great job understanding this and portraying him appropriately. I don't think there's any point in the film where I'm like, it was like just his whole attitude, this whole kind of holy thou attitude. He has a lot of kind of abuser tropes, the way he kind of yells at people, gets really close up to them, that whole kind of power thing. It's very reminiscent of real life, how real life abusers will kind of use their own body language. So yeah, that I think was an appropriate villain for this story. Dave Bautista, Karen Gillan, and Paul Clementief as Drax and Nebula Mantis form a kind of trio in this film that work well together, and allows them to explore what I think very extremely satisfying arcs with their own individual stories. In fact, I think they actually have the strongest character moments in the film between the three of them. Drax, that's one of my favorite part of the film is how Drax ends his story, and he ends by basically to rescue a bunch of these kind of children that the evolutionaries created, and so they've got this bunch of children that they've adopted, and Drax is crucial in saving them by going back to his roots as a family person, as a father, and acting childish with them like he would do to entertain his own daughter, and doing he says monkey noises, they're robot noises, but that's kind of his charm. And it's very much him. For a Thai film, people like trying to not put him down, but in the kind of the brutal honesty the Guardians often have, openly talk about how they don't think he has that much potential, other than the fact that they know that he loves them and they love him, but they feel a bit kind of like he's not going to accomplish much kind of attitude, which is a bit mean, but it's very consistent with the character. And then so not paying any attention to him, not even realizing that he's the solution to the problem, he lets his own heart, his soul, his true being come out. And I always felt like Drax was a bit robbed in Endgame from not having at least one scene or part of a scene that lets him get some degree of vengeance, even if it's kind of a half moment against Thanos, considering that vengeance was his most driving factor. But this film made me realize that his true arc, his true finale to his story, was always meant to be what he got here, where he basically is now the adopted father of all of these children, and it's the most perfect and beautiful end to his tragic backstory. And I don't think I've ever felt so happy for where a character has ever ended up. I sobbed, and I will continue to sob thinking about where his character is now, and it's like I'm so happy for him. And it's like I don't think I've ever been more happier for a fictional character. Like, genuinely, I'm so happy for him. Nebula's arc from villain to hero was one that Gunn also has been in the records to say that he feels strongly about how that should pan out, and it shows just like Drax did, she gets a really happy ending, and it's a very well executed change from villain to hero. For this film, you see again. Remember that there's a 5 to 10 year gap between when we see Nebula with the Guardians last, and here, not including the kind of end game moments and Infinity War moments and holiday special moments. And we see glimpses and we see it kind of lighten up, but here is kind of where we actually have truly start interacting with the Guardians as a Guardian, and you can see it from even they don't shy away from it from the get-go. She is a much more softer person when they carry a Peter who is passed out from drinking from alcohol from to kind of get to he's binging alcohol to get over his depression. So when she carries him to his bed, she actually tenderly holds his hand for a moment while he's unconscious, and throughout the film she's more joking. She's one of the most vocal proponents of protecting each other within their family. She gets the one time she gets genuinely angry is when she feels like Drax and Mantis, through their own incompetence, has jeopardized the lives of her family, and she gets genuinely angry at that point. The heartbreaking moment was when she hears Rocket's voice over the comm and realizes that he survived, and she lets herself cry, and it's a really great moment. And I love that Karen Gillan's been given this character to kind of evolve, and it makes sense because between 5 years during the snap, Rocket and Nebula, out of the Guardians and out of their original family, those were really two who had each other, so it makes sense that she would care so much about him. So I love that moment, and it generally did took my heartstrings. So and then she was also pivotal in giving Drax his ending, and she ends the film by dancing with all the children, and I cried about it too, so I'm so glad. Mantis is the newest member of the family, and so we're still kind of relatively being given less to deal with, because she wasn't given that much to do in her non-Guardians appearances, the Avengers films and the four films. So she really only started to actually get given any prominence in the holiday special, and I talked a bit in my review of the holiday special about that. But this film still gives her due arc, which is basically around her needing to be independent. She spent her entire life being a tool of ego, and even though she's treated much more lovingly by the Guardians, she's still a team member following their lead, not making her own path, and so I'm glad she gets her moment there. The very nature of Groot's character kind of lends itself to not necessitating as much of a prominent arc, but there's still an evolution in his character that is, still worthy of note. And in this depiction we see a new Groot. I mean, it's an older Groot of baby Groot, but it's still a new version of him. It's a young adult Groot who's very competent, who's very trusted, who's very powerful in the team, and it's lovely to see that kind of, growth, even if it's very visual in the background. And I do love the small kind of implication that understanding what Groot says isn't a matter of understanding the language, it's being part of Groot's family and being who Groot considers to be family. And so, and again, I think it's like a mutual element to that. So as soon as, Gamora in her heart opens herself up to Groot or to the Guardians, she then begins to understand Groot. And then the last time we hear Groot, he speaks in what we hear as English, which I guess implies that we are now part of the family as well. And that's a nice kind of cute moment. How they were going to execute Gamora in this film was always going to be a very interesting decision. Because this isn't the Gamora that we've known since 2014. This is the one we barely met in 2019's Endgame and didn't really get that much to explore, other than the brief scenes that we saw her in. So this film, rightly in my opinion, this film, rightly in my opinion, does not undo Gamora's death, the original Gamora's death, and it doesn't kind of try and in-universe retroactively make old Gamora become the original Gamora. She spends the entire film a very distinct character, and it's credit to Zoe Saldana that she is able to kind of depict these two characters in a way which helps us to dissociate her from her original character, but still feel that degree of pangs of loss and missing with original Gamora, the same one that Quill must be feeling when he's seeing someone who visually and in other respects acting like the Gamora that he knew, because obviously they diverged from the same point. So there's always so much different character, but also the way that they do different character does kind of re-emphasize the positive and healthy effect that the Guardians did have on her when her future self was with her. But sadly that'll never be enough to kind of course correct that back into the original Gamora, and nor should it. Miss Gamora's on a different path to different healing. So yeah, it was a very odd character to watch, because it was like, and it's fair, it makes sense, because if it was real life and someone died when a past identical version of that person appeared, you would feel very that kind of same level of uncertainty and like uncanny valley towards that person. So I think that's the right thing to feel, and I think that's a testament to how well they portray the character. This film is probably the one that Quill has the least to do in driving the plot, but that makes sense because he was a much more prominent factor in the previous Guardian Galaxy outings, so it's right for the best. But still, Chris Pratt portrays a more mature Quill here. The Quill we see in the previous kind of earlier films is much more of an adventurer, swashbuckling adventure type character. But in the later films, post his experience with Thanos, he's clearly a much more matured and somber character, and I feel that kind of plays appropriately into what's happened to him plot wise, and it plays into his eventual decision to, for now, retire from the Guardians and return home. His moments with Gamora feel very heartfelt but surprisingly respectful, and I think that also shows the development of character. He doesn't. You can tell as a character he's trying to strike balance between being desperate to get his Gamora back by any means necessary and being respectful this isn't actually his Gamora, and he shouldn't be like kind of trying to force something on her that she doesn't want to be part of, because it's underplayed, but it's presented very well, and eventually lead to an acceptance where he's able to accept his grievance of Gamora and put that well behind him. So I think, throughout the entire film's the evolution of Quill as a character has actually been done very, very well, and I feel this film does a good job of showing us a much more mature Peter Quill. Kraglin gets his own arc, but it's not really the strongest. His story is basically him continuing to struggle to use Yondu's arrow. It's mostly comedic until he remembers Yondu's message about it has to come from his heart, which is actually a line that he said to Quill for Quill's arc. And so it seems kind of odd that you can reuse that. It seems like it should be a comedic thing, but it's depicted as a serious kind of development. So I don't know. I don't really care much about that kind of subplot. It seems like it seems more like a joke that was drawn out too long, given too much kind of prominence. I guess there's not much else you can do to the character. And I love Kraglin as a character, his floppy skin thing notwithstanding. But despite that, I just couldn't care that much about his character arc in here. And equally, the weakest element in the film by far is Will Poulter as Alan Warlock. Poulter does a fantastic job. He's generally hilarious, but his character feels very superfluous to the plot. Everything that his character does, really, another character could, like any kind of generic move could have done. And it feels like he was only really included in this film to pay off the post-credit scene from 2017. In fact, most of his interactions in the film don't even involve the Guardians. And who the guys themselves can't even forget he's a threat, even though he is the instigating factor. But a bunch of nameless bounty hunters would equally have been an instigating factor. That being said, him being rescued at the end and him asking why, and Drax being like, well, it's because everyone deserves a second chance, is a nice callback to what is essentially the core theme of the Guardians. So yeah, I don't think this is my immediate kind of reactions. I don't think this is the strongest Guardians film, but that's not a negative criticism. The other two are very, very strong films. I just think out of the three, this is the one I'd probably rank lowest. But ultimately, and most importantly, it's an extremely satisfactory conclusion to their stories. It feels more like a closing chapter and epilogue rather than its own kind of thing, if that makes sense. I don't know if it does, but it's that's not, again, a criticism. I think that's an appropriate execution. At the end of the film, does the characters a lot of service, and I know that I will miss them, and I will continue to cry over Drax being a father again because I'm just so happy for him. Go Drax. That's my reactions to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Let me know what you think. And yeah, I need to go watch the Mario movie at some point. Yeah.